Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome to the Erickson Report. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I hope you'll find some things in there worthy of your consideration. As always, if you have any comments or reactions to the show, send them to me directly. My personal email, Whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. So with that, I'm going to get started. Because I remarked to somebody at work a few days before recording this that it's surely unusual for somebody to be able to say exactly what they were doing and exactly where they were exactly 50 years earlier. But I could. I could because at that time of day, exactly 50 years earlier, I was somewhere in Sussex County, New Jersey, heading on the roads to Bethel, New York, and the first day of what was promoted as an Aquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music, but which came to be known simply as Woodstock. As a self-confessed aging hippie, I suppose it's appropriate that I say something about the 50th anniversary of Woodstock, especially since I was actually there as opposed to the 4 or 5 million who now claim they were. Now, I don't want to come across as wallowing in nostalgia, but one of the things that I've realized over the past few days of seeing various remembrances and descriptions of the event, that some of the things that stick out most in my personal memory aren't among the things most commonly mentioned. In fact, the common thread among most of the coverage seems to have been the mud. For example, the Daily Mail described Woodstock as, and I'm quoting here, a trip of a party where increasingly filthy partygoers danced, stripped, and dropped acid in torrential rain. But the thing is, the mud really didn't happen until after the major thunderstorm on Sunday afternoon. Before that, on Friday and Saturday, yes, there had been rain. I remember Ravi Shankar playing through the rain and then Melanie having to move further back under cover because the rain was playing havoc with the tuning of her guitar. But it just wasn't that bad. Now, yes, it was rainy, but going the mud, just isn't right, especially because there was also a hot, dry sun to dry things out. So yeah, my memories are not the same as some others. So by way of commentary and as a way of opening a discussion of the world in which Woodstock happened, I'm going to tick off a couple of things that I recall that have not figured in the A Look Back At coverage. The first one actually wouldn't make the coverage because it was purely personal. My friend Craig and I, who had tickets, damn it, we headed up the back roads, avoiding the New York Thruway and Route 17 and thus the multiple hours long traffic jams. We managed to park actually just a couple of miles from the site. Now, coming into the site on that first day, there's a sort of dirt road that you went along, more like a track. It was actually probably used for farm vehicles on the farm. And the place where the concert actually was in a pasture that formed a natural hollow. And between the road and that pasture, there was a little rise. It's like 3 or 4 feet, a little rise. And you went up that rise and looked down into that hollow and, oh my God, there are tens of thousands of freaks. Hot damn. Now, foolishly, that night, Craig and I left the site because we didn't bring a tent. So we left to stay at a campsite shelter for hikers on the Appalachian Trail, which proved to be full, requiring us then to sleep outside, yes, in the rain. And the next day, when we went back, we actually wound up having to park some many teens of miles from the site. Walking into the site on that hot Saturday, I saw where a family had turned their hose on to give water to the walkers, people walking in. Now, I know, now you say don't drink the water from the hose, it's going to have bacteria in it and so forth and so on. But, this is 50 years ago. People weren't thinking about that. But this family turned the hose on, and I heard a woman saying to someone that she and her family had intended to ignore the festival entirely, completely ignore it. But then she heard that one of her neighbors was charging walkers $1 for a glass of water. Now remember, this was 50 years ago, charging $1 for a glass of water. And they found that just so outrageous that they said, we have to do something. Just charging these kids for a glass of water. She was outraged. Another highlight, maybe the musical, for me, the musical highlight of the festival was Ravi Shankar, with whose music I was not actually terribly familiar at that time, but he just completely blew me away. I also remember Abby Hoffman announcing from the stage that we were page 1 of the Sunday New York Times. I remember the several minutes long standing ovation given to Max Yasgur and him saying something about how it should be a lesson to his generation that, and this is not a quote, but it's close enough. 400,000 young people can come together for 3 days of peace and music and have nothing but peace and music. Which wasn't literally true, of course. There were various little incidents and so on, but it was close enough to be a fair description. Okay, on Sunday, Craig noticed and alerted me to the big and amazingly black thunderclouds headed our way several minutes before the announcement was made for the stage. And I also learned that, there's a point where you're wet enough that it just doesn't matter anymore. You're wet. You don't even try to stay dry at that point. But a while after the storm passed, some National Guard helicopters started hovering over the crowd. Now, at the time, there was enough paranoia in the counterculture, which was not completely unjustified, I have to say. You know the old saying that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. But anyway, there was enough paranoia that this really caused a stir in the crowd. And look, what's going on? What's going on? And now the doors of the helicopters are opening. What's going on here? And suddenly, from out of these helicopters come thousands and thousands of daffodils. The National Guard is showering the crowd with daffodils. I tried to catch one, but it bounced off my hand and into the hand of a short girl next to me who probably could have gotten one otherwise, so that was cool. My favorite memorabilia from the event was not the tickets, which I actually might still have somewhere, but I really think are buried in the sands of time, but rather a newspaper ad that came out a few weeks later. The long-distance bus company that served the area of Bethel had this ad, this quarter-page ad, expressing how impressed its drivers were with the patience, kindness, and friendliness of the concert-goers who were stuck in traffic for umpteen hours because of the traffic. I remember one of those drivers being quoted as saying that as a result of the experience, a long-haired kid is welcome on my bus anytime. Which in 1969, for us, that was music to our ears. The other possibility for my favorite memorabilia would be my sleeping bag, which was thoroughly soaked and must have weighed like 50 pounds when I was trying to carry it out, but which I still have. All right, all of this raises the ultimate question that always gets asked. Will there ever be another Woodstock? The answer to that question is no, there won't be. Because you see, the thing is, what made Woodstock Woodstock, what made the whole experience what it was that it just happened. It wasn't anticipated. It sure as hell wasn't planned. The organizers were prepared for a crowd of like 50,000, not 8 or 10 times that many. It wasn't something anyone set out to create. It just happened. So no, there'll never be another Woodstock. Now, there may well be, or already have been, a whatever, or maybe a whatever, or a somewhere else. But those will be what they are or were, existing on their own terms, existing as something that just happened. And they'll be great, but they won't be Woodstock. They will be themselves. All right, with that, before I get into other stuff I want to talk about, let's take a break. And we're back. All right, there's another reason besides aging hippie nostalgia that I bring all this up. Woodstock did not exist, did not occur in a social or political vacuum. For one thing, the Vietnam War was at its perhaps most intense. Now, we could measure that by casualty figures, and those for the Indo-Chinese is actually hard to come by. Even the overall estimates for the entire war are they're estimates. But we do have hard figures for Americans. In 1968, 16,592 Americans were killed in Vietnam. In 1969, the number proved out to be 11,616. Now look at just that 1968 figure, just that one. Those 16,600 deaths are more than double the total number of American soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined across the entire histories of those wars up to the present day. And the opposition to the war in Vietnam was becoming more intense as well. There were demonstrations on college campuses all throughout the year, all across the country. A couple of months before Woodstock, in April, there had been mass rallies in places like New York and Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, and so on. 2 months after Woodstock, in October 15th, the National Moratorium to End the War in Vietnam arranged for a series of local demonstrations. There were a couple of thousand of them, that all of which occurred on that day, with a total participation of it's estimated between 5 and 7 million. A month after that, November 15th, 500,000 people turned out in Washington, D.C. to protest the war, a couple of 100,000 more in San Francisco. But while the war may have been the most obvious issue to us, it was not the only one. Civil rights, for example, had seen some legislative successes earlier in the decade, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But the inadequacies of those gains was clearly demonstrated in what became known as the Long Hot Summer of 1967, when riots driven by frustrations and economic desperation broke out in black neighborhoods in 159 U.S. cities. At the time of Woodstock, the phrase black liberation and what that meant was a part of every conversation about race or civil rights. But in turn, it was the strength of those two movements, peace and civil rights, which gave vigor to, gave extra strength to, and impetus to a third movement, as women in those movements got fed up with being expected to always be in the background, to do the work and get none of the credit. The expression male chauvinist pig came into circulation around that time. Sometimes it's a teasing warning when preceded by don't be a, but also used as a sneering, dismissive put-down of various very deserving targets. And speaking of being fed up, less than 3 weeks before Woodstock, in Greenwich Village in New York City, some patrons of a gay club and dance bar known as the Stonewall Inn decided they were fed up. They had had it with police hassling, assaulting, and arresting them for the crime of being gay or lesbian. What became known as the Stonewall Riots, but should probably more properly be called the Stonewall Uprising. These riots went on and off for 5 days. It gave birth to the modern movement for LGBTQ rights. In fact, the first Gay Pride March actually was less than a year later. Meanwhile, the long-standing movement against nuclear weapons was beginning to expand into opposition to nuclear power, thereby connecting with, or at least overlapping with, some of the environmental movement, which itself was gaining strength. Let's recall that the first Earth Day, which was probably the only real occurrence of an event that is now government and corporate approved, but the first Earth Day took place only 8 months after Woodstock. Now, so all of this and more, lots more, was swirling around and through the culture in the summer of 1969. That was the atmosphere, if you will, the milieu in which Woodstock occurred. Now, Woodstock was by no means intended as a political event, but it was a cultural event, and it proved to be a major cultural event, and as such, could not stand apart from the political currents of the time. What Woodstock was, what it became, was affected by what went on around it. Now, I'm not saying at all that everybody that went to Woodstock was a dedicated political or cultural activist, or even less am I saying that anyone who went to Woodstock did it with the idea that this is a conscious political statement. Well, I should say I actually expect that Most of those seen in tie-dye t-shirts, jeans, and sandals in the summer of 1969 were no more interested in the larger world except as how it affected them personally than those in whatever hipper-than-thou gear is popular today do today. But at the same time, going was a statement of sorts. Semiotics is the study of sign process. It's a study of signs and symbols as part of communication, which then would include the study of the various signs and symbols that various cultures and subcultures declare themselves. Ever since Monterey Pop in 1967, you could pretty much knew that by going to a big rock festival, you'll be surrounded by people with long hair in colorful clothes and, yes, tie-dye t-shirts, jeans, and sandals. People who were thereby signing that you and they shared a set of cultural values, that you were with your tribe. Now, the point here is, well, you can't say that Woodstock was a conscious political event, nor can you say that those attending were all political or cultural activists. You can say that all the cultural and political activists who attended Woodstock shared a number of cultural assumptions with those around them, certain cultural principles that have become emblematic of what became known as the counterculture. Cultural principles such as sharing, rejection of competition, and embracing of exploration and discovery, both physical and spiritual. In other words, that is, those activists pursued a political activism that was rooted in cultural, not just intellectual or traditionally political roots, and also was rooted in a lifestyle that knew the words others and future as emotional touchstones, not as just rhetorical devices or statistical measures, which is something that distinguished the so-called new left of the 60s with the old left of previous generations, who could quote political theory chapter and verse and chant slogans with the best of them, but who often made it sound like the people on whose behalf they were trying or claiming to speak were more like exhibits in a court case than actual living, breathing human beings. Indeed, a significant part of 60s activism was essentially cultural activism, the live your life as an example to other idea, and the intentional or conscious communities that set out to prove that there were juster and fairer ways to organize our social relations. Beyond that, one positive aspect of that footing in cultural as well as political values was the relative ease with which the movement became multi-issue. Whenever those distressing and depressing arguments about the tactic or the issue arose, a significant portion of this movement just couldn't see what all the fuss was about. Hey, you work on what you think is important, I'll work on what I think is important, and whatever it can make the two overlap, we'll work together. Simple. We're actually, after pretty much the same end, right? Now, the same end part was not always, or maybe not even usually, common or accurate, I should say, but it was true enough to keep things bubbling along without the movement getting bogged down into endless and unresolvable disputes about the relative importance of the arms race versus feminism versus the environment versus racism versus economic concerns versus and on and on and on. In short, I firmly believe that perhaps the core energy source for the movement of the 60s was that area where political involvement and cultural and spiritual concerns overlapped to form a politically involved counterculture. That energy gave us the sense that you could make a difference, that your dreams could be lived out, that they really could come true, that the future was wide open and all things were possible. And it enabled us to keep trying. For all the sexism we came to acknowledge in the counterculture and the peace movement, people kept trying to live more egalitarian lives. For all of the undercurrents of racism we dug out of white activist relations with black groups, people kept trying to work it out and live more justly. For all of our awareness of our umbilical cord connections to the consumer society, people kept trying to live more simply with greater ecological awareness. There was a real sense that you could make it better, both in yourself and in others, by your social example and your political activism. It was that sense, especially when slammed up against the reality of the America we saw around us as opposed to the America we were taught to believe in school, that produced anger and joy, tough determination and bitter compassion, bitter awareness and sweet dreams, that together marked a movement that over a several year span was strong enough to end the draft, limit and finally stop a war, drive one and maybe two presidents from office, shake the foundation of a society's beliefs about half its population, open millions of eyes to the evils of racism, force the nuclear power industry to a virtual halt, set in motion other movements for change, and change, perhaps not by much, but certainly permanently, that society's sense of its relationship to the environment. And it's good we have that record of success, of progress, because of course it's true that ultimately in a lot of ways we failed. Our dreams could not be lived out, at least not full force. The future is not wide open, not all things are possible. Sexism and racism persist, poverty and hunger still haunt us. Climate change is a sort of Damocles over us. And yes, we stopped the war. But the changes we made weren't enough to prevent new wars and more wars. Wars that, as Donovan sang in 1970, drag on. We got hemmed in some cases weighed down, by commitments and obligations of a different sort, not to that broader community, but to the narrower community of family, of spouses, of children, of aging parents, and to the jobs and careers that sustain those commitments. This doesn't mean that we surrendered. The 60s generation actually went disproportionately into what are called helping or caring fields, such as health and medicine, social work, education, public interest law, that kind of thing. But it does mean that the task we set for ourselves was bigger than we let ourselves imagine. Our community, our tribe, came together so easily, so naturally, that we thought it would stay that way just as easily and naturally, which, in retrospect, it's easy to say, of course, it couldn't. Some of those other commitments and the other obligations arose. We didn't put in the effort. We didn't do the work necessary to keep our tribe together, so we lost it. We lost the sense that we were all part of the movement with a capital M, that vaguely defined but still somehow organic whole of which we were part. Between that and the end of the Indochina War, which for a not insignificant number of people was the basis for their political activism, with that core energy was gone, and I would say it marked the end of the 60s as a political movement. All right, now the question then is, does any of that matter for today? Is it relevant in any way other than just historical analysis? Well, frankly, I think it does, and it is. I see around me today multiple campaigns for change, but I don't see a movement. I don't see any evidence that people involved in any of those various efforts conceive of themselves as part of a bigger whole. Do those who identify with Me Too feel a kinship with Black Lives Matter and the discussions about reparations? Do the people who focus on global warming see themselves as part of the same overall effort as those who are struggling to raise the minimum wage or to protect voting rights? I don't think they do, and it is to the loss of each and every one of them. I was struck by something just recently. Bernie Sanders made a speech, okay? He covered various topics in the speech. Afterwards, there was a commentator who slammed the speech and Sanders because he didn't mention gender or race until 23 minutes in, and yes, she said she clocked it. Actually, she was wrong. He mentioned about 5 minutes in, but that's not the point. The point is she was slamming the speech and Sanders, not for anything he said about race or gender, which apparently to her was at least unobjectionable. She was attacking him because he didn't say it soon enough in the speech. He didn't give her focus privilege of place. Bluntly, in the 1960s, the response to that criticism would have been along the lines of, what the hell difference does that make? This was a speech, not a top 10 list ranked according to importance. When the order in which topics are presented in a speech becomes a basis for criticism, we do not have a movement. We have a series of atomized, isolated efforts that are incapable of drawing strength from each other. And worse, it seems to me that there's developed a divide between the two fundamental types of activism, which I call inside and outside. By inside, I mean a style of activism that focuses on political campaigns, elections, lobbying, and that sort of thing, to the exclusion of other means. Now, I got to tell you, that will fail you ultimately. And what's more, the apparent distaste some of those folks have for street actions does genuine damage to our overall cause. Elections surely have their place, a vital place, a necessary place in the process of change. But they're not the only part. They are not even the first part of the process, because change comes from outside. As Margaret Mead is supposed to have said, never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. But on the other hand, those who do go outside, those who favor street action, pickets, rallies, mass demonstrations, civil disobedience, and the like, people, and I have to say that despite all of the lobbying and political campaigning I've done, my heart is on the streets. But people like me then need to understand that we need those working the inside route, because otherwise our demands and proposals will remain unfulfilled demands and proposals if there's no one there to act on them. Those sides of activism, inside and outside, should be, if I can use a cliche, two sides of the same coin. But now it seems like they're different worlds, each observing the other from a distance. And every bit of lobbying and campaigning, every rally-driven demand is weaker for it. Yes, there have been victories, there have been successes. Don't think for even an instant that I'm denigrating the effort of the people who have put in that work or the successes that have been achieved. But I can't help but be distressed about how many of those campaigns have been aimed at preventing losses of what was gained earlier by earlier movements, rather than by going further and gaining more. We need to do better. I will leave you with this. I am hardly the first to raise the idea of the lack of an overarching message for the progressive, which simply means that others have noted the same atomized nature of our efforts that I'm critiquing here, except that I would change it from a lack of an overarching message to a lack of a feeling of connection, a connection that we are all one, a connection that we are family, despite our different focuses, that we are of the same tribe, even if that connection lies more in convictions, in the way that like a religious congregation feels a connection among themselves, even if you can't see any outward signs of that connection. So for your consideration, I am offering what I suppose you could call a shared religion, a set of shared convictions, a secular religion that stands on three mutually supported legs: justice, compassion, and community. Conceive of every political action you take, or that anyone else takes, whether inside or outside, as a reflection of one or more of those principles, and realize that you are one particular effort, one particular individual effort, one individual strand, one of multiple strands that very much need to be woven together to make a capital M movement stronger than all of its parts. One more last important piece of advice: do not repeat the mistakes of the past. I'm sure you won't repeat my generation's mistakes of overconfidence, but also don't repeat the mistakes of other generations. Don't slice away your friends and supporters in a foolish attempt to avoid criticism or look more mainstream. It will not help you, it never has, it never will, and it only narrows the field of fire for the reactionaries. And do not divide yourself into sectarian camps where people are dissed or dismissed for not using quite the preferred language or having a different focus than you do, because that way lies madness and the death of dreams. That's it for me. I'm done. We will see you again very soon. In the meantime, as always, peace.